Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session of the Kuyper Conference for 2018. My name is Kurt Schaefer. I teach economics here at Calvin College, and I'm a proud graduate of Calvin Theological Seminary. This panel, we have three terrific panelists, and we'll organize it as I imagine most of your panels have been organized here, about 10 minutes for each panelist to make some introductory comments. Then about 30 minutes for the panelists to converse, and then about a half hour for conversation among panelists and you. I want to thank especially the Acton Institute for being part of their sponsorship of the conference shows up in the mention that they sponsor this session. In my experience, they are tremendous, genial, intelligent, well-read, civil conversation partners, and that's a rare thing, isn't it? And if you've not been engaged with their journal, Markets and Morality, I'd encourage you to take a look. So our first panelist today is Michael Dalma. And Michael, I tend to introduce by interview. So let's just hear a little about Michael Dalma. You're an associate research professor at Georgetown University.
Assistant.
Assistant, yeah, don't want to get that wrong. And you live in a cabin in West Virginia where you do some woodworking. Why don't you just tell us a little about what it's like to be living in West Virginia and be on the research faculty at Georgetown University?
Now that I live in the country, I grew up in the suburbs here. There's all sorts of things, these advantages in the country. You don't have to pay for a suntanning booth. You don't have to pay for a gym. You're like doing all this. I haven't gone to the gym in like 2 years. You're just swinging an axe all the time, and moving stuff around. You get free sunlight to dry your clothes. I recommend everybody live in the country. The country gentleman life is for me. Driving to D.C. is terrible, but once I'm in D.C., it's fantastic. Nice people to work with, a lot of motivation. And I'd say, I guess that's it.
You're an institute director at Georgetown, Institute for the Study of Markets and Ethics. Mm-hmm. Would you like to tell us a little about the life of the institute?
Yeah, so the best way to describe it is that we're a business ethics institute. It's called the Institute for the Study of Markets and Ethics, which is normative questions. How ought we act in the marketplace? A lot of people, especially from a Christian background, they think ethics is essentially a Christian thing. But of course, ethics is primarily a secular thing. It's about how to argue. It's about what arguments are strong and weak, and you can rely on Christian arguments if you want, but might not convince other people. And so I'm a historian who works for philosophers in a business school.
And you call yourself an interdisciplinary historian on your website. Will you give us a little sense of what that means for you?
I'm writing a book, or I have a book coming out called Creative Historical Thinking. And one thing I encourage people in the book to do is if you ever run out of ideas, if you ever have writer's block, the problem is that you probably don't have a diverse enough set of experiences. And you need to reach into other disciplines, go to other conferences of other types. So for me, for example, for a long time I went to like folklore conferences, which is actually really similar to like cultural anthropology, and you get some ideas from them. Come to theology conferences, go to econ conferences, etc., and you bring back these tools into your own discipline. You see different ways of looking at the world. And so now as a historian, I can learn how to critically deep read a text. I can learn how to analyze thousands of pages of something. I can look for sociological concepts that structure the things that I'm looking for, right? All these different ways, etc., of finding information and approaching something. And I think that's the way to go for creativity.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, cool. All right, so I got a few comments that I wrote down on, let's see, where do I start?
Michael,
on this panel.
probably for the tape, I should have mentioned the title of this session, shouldn't I?
Oh, sure, yeah.
So it's entitled Neocalvinism and Economics, in Context, Comparison, and Application.
Right. And of course, I want to thank the Acton Institute and Calvin College for hosting this and putting it all together. But I'm a little worried that this topic, the title, is too broad. I was talking with Sarah before this, and we're trying to figure out exactly what it is that we're supposed to talk about or we want to talk about. And so I think we can lead this discussion in many different directions. And perhaps instead of giving answers, I'm going to give some suggestions for possible directions and some things to think about. If you don't know the answers, come up with some questions, right? So first of all, are we here thinking about the Neo-Calvinist view on economics? This is one possible thing. to say, maybe there's similar social insights between sphere sovereignty and different types of diverse sets of knowledge in the market, or something like this? Are we talking about the context of the historical context, or the present context, the context of this conference? Even the context is, the term context in the title is ambiguous. So I'm a historian first, an ethicist or an economist far down the line, and almost nothing of a scholar of Neocalvinism. But let me suggest first a few ground rules for discussing the context of Neocalvinism in economics. And I think one of the important things here is that we need to avoid straw manning, or philosophers sometimes say weak manning, economics or the econ profession, because it's very easy, I think, to misunderstand what economists do. And we shouldn't make the following three errors. First, we shouldn't confuse rational acting, means, ends, action with perfect rationality or knowledge. I hear this all the time. Obviously, human beings are not rational. Economists are only studying rationality, and they're wrong. Well, that's not what they're doing, because, of course, in English, rationality means two things: means, ends, relations. In that sense, all human beings are rational, but we're not perfectly informed or make perfect decisions, right? So that's one thing as Christians who maybe don't study economics, we need to understand about economics. We must also not treat economics as concerned only with wealth or predictions. I'm sure you get this all the time. You guys are economists, tell me what stocks to buy, tell us how to get rich, or the criticism, you guys only care about money over there in the business school, which is not the case at all. Economics is about satisfying wants, it's about alleviating poverty, things like this, and maybe that's a way that Neo-Calvinism and economics can work together towards some common goals. And then third, I think in this category of weak manning or straw manning economics, we can't say that positive economics is insufficient, that we just have this homo economicus view of the world over in the economics profession, and we just simply need to add some normativity to things. So drop in some Christian normativity, and we've solved the problems of what to do with economics. So those are my three ground rules, and I also have three questions then to consider. And first of all, and I think maybe this is perhaps the question that the panel, direction that the panel will take, I'm not sure, is can there be a Christian economics? And I found this really interesting reading some Herman Dooyeweerd for this conference, trying to do some background reading on this. You say yay, but I'm not sold on him yet. I need to read him some more, and I criticize him as perhaps, I don't know yet, the Deepak Chopra of Calvinism, because it seems so new agey and difficult to understand. And so if there is a Christian economics, is this merely positive, value-free, wertfrei economics applied to Christian ends? Is there a distinctly Christian economics? And if so, I mean, I wonder, does this even make sense? Is there a Christian geometry, Christian mathematics, et cetera, et cetera? Where do we draw the line between scientific knowledge and revealed knowledge and claim too much? Or, like I said, hinted at before, is Christian economics merely just applying some Christian normative framework to standard economic theory? Here we get into all tangled kinds of questions, and I've read some and reviewed some, actually, Christian economic books in the past, and I always wonder when they make comments and say, like, monetarism is better than Keynesianism or vice versa, by what Christian principles can we even make these judgments? Can we claim that a certain form of economics is Christian or not? Is it just life-affirming principles or this or that? Or can we even say Marxist economics is Christian or not? I'm not sure. Okay. My second question to consider is, well, I think maybe I covered that. Does sphere sovereignty tell us anything about monetary or fiscal policy? Does it tell us anything about welfare states? Is the social goal of Neo-Calvinism to create economic political equals, right? Is equality a goal? Would any economic system be just so long as it was life-affirming or provided conditions for the spread of the gospel? Is that Christian economics? That is, we have to question what the ultimate ends of economics is as Christians. Is it to satisfy subjective values of individuals or to pave the way for some divine ends, some individual values notwithstanding? And I think this is not an inconsequential problem, because I discover this especially in conservative circles. Conservative Christians at the far margins have really struggle to understand that values can be subjective. That people have subjective values because they want to think that all values are determined by God and are objective. I don't think it's any limitations on the omnipotence of God to say that individuals have subjective values at the same time as God has objective values, and we can't necessarily square these things, right? Finally, an interesting question about Neocalvinism in economics we might ask is, what does this tell us about wealth? Usury, Calvin opposed it. Luther opposed it. The tradition of the Western world is generally in opposition to usury, but today all of us support it. I mean, who here has not had a home loan at the new rate is 4.5%. Mortgage rates are going up, so I don't know, either buy your house now or whatever you think the market's doing. Buy it now or wait. I don't know. We don't know. Buy or don't buy. That's the economist's advice. One or the other. Yeah, you got two choices. So are Calvinism's criticisms of wealth and usury only a reflection of historical context and popular opinions, or do they actually reflect something deeper, something Christian? And maybe we can find some, I mean, there's plenty of arguments in the Bible against usury, so we can certainly find Christian reasons to take certain economic stances as well. How am I doing on time?
You're fine.
Okay, a couple more minutes. But as a historian, I thought I would give maybe a little bit of historical context in the rise of Neo-Calvinism, and something that I've been thinking about that might be another interesting way of taking this. And of course, Neo-Calvinism arises in, I guess I would say, the late 19th century. Like I say, I'm no expert on Neo-Calvinism. And there's a number of things going on at the same time that might have some influence on the way Neo-Calvinism is developing or not developing, and perhaps should have. One of them is historicism, and by this I mean the traditional German historical views deriving in the 19th century, saying that some knowledge is contextual, that the medieval world believes that all knowledge is universal, is logical, is divine, consists for all time. The German historicists said, no, some knowledge is actually dependent on the context and is different from historical circumstance to historical circumstance. This went hand in hand with liberalism, I think, with modernism, with criticism of universal values, and is a challenge, perhaps, to the view of revealed knowledge. If some knowledge is contextual, perhaps we can take it in what I call historicism 2, the version of Karl Popper. We can take it to the view that we can actually derive universal values from historical circumstance, not just contingent values, but even universal values. So that's one problem that the Calvinists are facing in the 19th century in general, is the rationalism, historicism, etc., that comes with considering that maybe some knowledge is not universal and revealed, but is contextual and historical. At the same time, in the 1870s, in three places concurrently, we have the rise of marginalism in economics, the recognition of subjective values, once again, knowledge and values deriving from individuals. And from what I can tell, Neo-Calvinists feared this individualism, and I'm not sure they ever incorporated marginalist subjective value thinking into their thought. I don't know, maybe somebody can tell me otherwise. So the final question then is, were Calvinists ready for such great social and economic changes in the 19th century? And I think certainly not, because nobody was. You look across the United States, you see the waning influence of ministers, you see the rising power of politicians and industrialists, and the response from the Calvinists is to try to regain some of the power that they're losing to science and rationalists, to economists, etc. on the margins, pun intended, as they're struggling to exert themselves. And maybe Neocalvinism is a reaction, maybe perhaps even an overreaction to these other developments in the 19th century that are claiming other sources of knowledge, that are threatening just revealed knowledge, just this sense that the whole world is structured and all knowledge comes from the Bible. Okay, that's a few things then to consider, both as a historian, an ethicist, an economist. That's about all I know. So there you go. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael. Sarah Estelle, fellow economist. Sarah, I think we just need to defend our competence in making forecasts after those comments by Michael, because the economists have correctly forecast 9 of the last 4 recessions. So, Sarah, you are Roux Faculty Fellow at Hope College, right down the street in Samaria down there. You're on the Mackinac Center Board of Scholarships. You're founding director of Markets Morality Student Organization at Hope College. You want to tell us a little about these leadership roles that you have and your kind of entrepreneurial spirit in being an academic?
Oh, thank you. The Ruck Faculty Fellow position, new in our Department of Economics and Business at Hope, has been really supportive of my research agenda, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in my remarks. Been able to more explicitly integrate faith and scholarship than I have been able to in previous positions. But Hope's also been very supportive of me engaging students in a wide-ranging and long-lasting conversation of big ideas, certainly through a Christian lens, but looking at policy and economic thinking, even going into culture and philosophy and some other areas. I've been really encouraged by the student response and love for a liberal arts agenda in this purely extracurricular activity. So they read books for fun, and they come to my house every couple weeks to discuss them. And then every few weeks we have a speaker or a film on campus. We showed the Poverty Inc. film. Poverty Cure has also been shown on our campus, but when we showed Poverty Inc. on campus, we had 650 people come one night. So it's just been a great encouragement. So I'd say that's the source of whatever entrepreneurial spirit I have at Hope, is just the repeated encouragement to do these good things on campus. It's been a blessing.
And your more formal academic scholarship has also been, first there's an interest in Hayek, and that kind of naturally connects to this entrepreneurial spirit of yours, I think. But you also, you've done published work in criminal justice, public policy, risky health behaviors, parents' investment in children's education, role of government in human flourishing. It's quite a diverse and prospering research agenda. Is there anything you'd like to identify as sort of a favorite project right now you're working on or have on the horizon?
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've been thinking about with respect to Hayek, but I'm also waiting for a decision on a revise and resubmit on an article about criminal justice reform. So I'd say that's probably my favorite right now, because I've got high hopes that that this paper will stick someplace good soon. That's a co-authored work with a colleague previously at Hope, now at Notre Dame, looking at the effects of the severity of criminal sentencing on later recidivism. And I just think that's such an important human issue, right? There's not just public budgets at stake here. Does locking people up actually increase public safety? But a lot of former offenders' lives, right, that are impacted in important and oftentimes very detrimental ways by long-term incarceration. So yeah, I have a bit of a double research agenda, still wanting to maintain some really important empirical work, but because of the encouragement at Hope College, I've been able to think a lot more explicitly about some of the things that initially got me excited about economics, which were the big ideas, being educated in a classical liberal tradition of economics and being able to come back to that in large part in discussion with students and now with my scholarship. And so looking at our title for the panel, I thought that I would probably have, not necessarily comparative advantage, but that my area might most naturally be in the comparison piece. I was really happy that Michael has already defended my discipline to you all, and so that's a relief. I have to say sometimes I have that urge in an interdisciplinary setting to spend my 10 minutes talking about how economics isn't all the bad things that you might think it is. But in talking about in comparison, Neocalvinism, economics, in my part maybe a little bit of the classical liberal tradition, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my background as well, because I think it illuminates where my interest comes from in Neo-Calvinism, but also my motivation for the particular connections that I want to draw. So as I've said, I am a mainstream neoclassical economist by training. I was raised in an evangelical church, but not in the Reformed tradition. I didn't have an opportunity to integrate faith and scholarship explicitly until I started at Hope in 2012. Still, it didn't take much convincing for me to understand that all truth is God's truth, and as a lover of the liberal arts, I wanted to see that put into practice by bridging disciplines. Some of my earliest economics learning, as I mentioned, was in the classical liberal tradition, and so I'm kind of naturally drawn towards a variety of ideas, from Adam Smith to F.A. Hayek and so many others, especially who write, I think, with a great degree of wonder, right? Wonder at the order that exists within civilization, order that might result in market prices or efficiency or economic growth. And they see this order in civilization at the same time noting that it's not by design, at least not by human design. Right? Because as a Christian, and in the words of my childhood faith tradition, I would say that I believe that God has a plan for everyone and everything, and ultimately He is the designer. Understanding that design is not just for each individual and actually covers communities and all of the created order is something that's come to me a little bit more recently as I've been exposed to Reformed theology, first by osmosis, living in West Michigan and working at Hope College, but then eventually by delving into some good reading and certainly many helpful conversations with colleagues of mine at Hope. And so here I should probably insert that kind of analogous statement on the first page of each journal article where people acknowledge the people who have made important contributions. So I certainly have to thank my colleagues for helping me through this process to the extent that I've kind of in the process, certainly, but also the Acton Institute who provide right, our country, the world, but especially being in West Michigan, just so many opportunities for learning about solid theology and seeing that come together with other topics that I'm really passionate about. And so the important part of the acknowledgement, right, we all know that it's necessary for me to say, and this is true, any errors or fuzziness that remains in my theological reasoning is totally to my credit or discredit, how that may be. So I'm very grateful for the influence of others, but I will take credit for any mistakes that I might make today. Another thing about me that helps me think about this in comparison piece is I just really find myself naturally drawn to synthesizing, right? Synthesizing seemingly disparate ideas. And even this is something I find kind of a neo-Calvinist tendency. I think Kuyper gives a couple very clear encouragements or reasons to be encouraged in this direction as Christian scholars to make connections. And the first thing I see is that common grace suggests that there are useful insights to be gathered even from unbelieving scholars. And so while there are many Christian economists that I know and respect and find agreement with in many cases, there are also many brilliant minds in my discipline who were or are not Christian. In fact, as I mentioned, much of my research today is focusing on the writings of Nobel laureate and self-professed agnostic F.A. Hayek. And I'm looking at the complementarity between his observations and small o Orthodox Christianity, things about human nature, cultural evolution, and institutions, including the economic order. And so much of the remainder of my remarks will focus on these connections between Hayek, in the case of today, also Neo-Calvinism. The second inspiration I find is in Kuyper's most famous quote, eloquently communicating the pervasiveness of Christ's lordship. And in light of my childhood faith tradition, it's helpful for me to be reminded that Christ is Lord and ruler over all, and not only personal Savior, such that, for example, faith and science are not opposed to one another. In general, Neocalvinism's rejection of dualism has been eye-opening for me, and Reformed theology has provided me a coherent framework for seeing that everything happens within the context of God's plan for creation, so that whatever an economist accurately observes reveals truth, and that truth often reflects something of theological importance, whether it's evidence of the effects of the fall, or indication of the original design, or insights about the habits and institutions that can, in practice, transform and redeem a broken world. So for the remainder of my time, I want to draw on just three complementarities, if not explicit similarities, between Hayek and Neo-Calvinism, especially as found in Kuyper's discussion of the social order. So the first connection I want to point out is not just about Hayek and Kuyper, but actually economics and biblical Christianity generally, and that's the principle of stewardship. To a Christian economist, I think this might be obvious, right? That economics is really all about stewardship and wise use of resources. But to some Christians, as Michael pointed out, economics is all about wealth, right? Or it seems like, it appears that we economists must be obsessed with wealth and always wanting to possess more. To some economists, Christianity is an interior practice, and this principle of stewardship, well, to the extent that they even have access to that word, it operates as a synonym for sustainability or some other kind of vague term. In truth, the Reformed tradition offers a rich understanding of stewardship. Likewise, within economics, efficiency, rightly understood, should incorporate a similarly nuanced understanding of employing what we've been blessed with to make the greatest gains toward our objectives. Hayek even seems to evolve in his understanding of this over the course of his professional life, initially using the term sound decision-making, which I read roughly as efficiency, efficient decisions, but later emphasizing his appreciation for what he calls the morals and traditions that, for example, reduce child mortality and support increasing numbers of human lives. So stewardship, I think, is a motivation towards for the economic discipline. So the second connection I want to talk about between Kuyper and Hayek in particular is that they are both skeptical of human reason and also are rather realistic about human motives. Neo-Calvinists reject the Enlightenment idea of the superiority of human reason, noting that people are both finite and rebellious. Hayek expresses the idea of individuals' finitude when he writes about the essentially local nature of knowledge. And this was one of his main contributions as recognized by the Nobel Committee. So essentially local knowledge. But even as an agnostic, I think it's interesting to note that he also recognizes the biases and what he calls natural animalistic tendencies of people by instinct to engage only with those who look like them or live within their tribe or family. While he is skeptical of reason, he also does not elevate the natural, but rather says these tendencies are detrimental as well. So far as I can tell in my research thus far, this is as close as Hayek gets maybe to a notion of sin. Kuyper and his anti-revolutionary party were opposed to popular sovereignty and individualism for some of the same reasons, I think, that Hayek opposed an overreaching state. Namely, that reason cannot bring about intentional man-made improvements in the presence of limited ability and selfish desire. As a side note, I think all of this suggests that an attitude of humility is appropriate for Christians and classical liberals alike, as seen in Kuyper's own awareness of his personal limitations and Hayek's skepticism of central planning, including by intellectuals like himself. So third and finally, I want to talk a little bit about sphere sovereignty, a concept that I find largely compatible with Hayek's appreciation of decentralization, a decentralization of decision-making that's necessitated by his notion of local knowledge. Both Kuyper and Hayek, in observing what is, right, observing reality, not just what should be, but what is, conclude that there is a limited role for the state. They come to this conclusion by different means, right? Kuyper observes that God is supremely sovereign and therefore all other authority is allocated by God. Consequently, though the state is God ordained and has a crucial role, the state is not primary and rights do not come from the state. Hayek likewise considers the state to have a critical role, especially in providing for the rule of law. But Hayek also observes that the sorts of information one needs to make sound decisions is essentially dispersed and particular to time and place. Thus, decisions that require information of this variety must be made in a decentralized way, such that different people and diverse institutions are important in making sound decisions. Hayek and Kuyper even agree that the pattern within a sphere or domain should be different across domains. One might think that Hayek, being an economist, thinks all decisions should be economic, but he's very clear to say that the family would be crushed under the weight of market-type relationships. And in fact, that we each face a challenge in that we must live simultaneously in two worlds. In one, we interact according to a particular set of norms, right? Within our family and our local communities, we operate differently than when we're making good use of what he calls the extended order, where we have impersonal yet moral interactions with a larger group of people. The importance even of intersphere differences is notable in the language that Kuyper and Hayek use, or even more, the language they choose not to use. Kuyper has a distaste for the term civil society, I think because it's too blanket a term to capture the diversity of the spheres and this one aspect of the manyness that he appreciates. Likewise, Hayek dislikes the word social, but rather is a fan of diversity and finding ways for the many and diverse to interact in mutually beneficial ways. Finally, so as not to just pick on the state, we should also note that Kuyper and Hayek both see a limited role for the church. Of course, they recognize that different domains have distinct objectives and abilities, but I think it's also interesting to note that both Kuyper and Hayek appreciate the formation of individuals that happens within the church, or in the case of Hayek, monotheistic religion in general. And so these are three complementarities that I've found in my research. I have others in mind, and certainly there are some nuances that I've glossed over at this point, but I'd be happy to discuss it with my co-panelists or the audience later. Thank you.
Gideon Strauss. Gideon, on your website, you introduce yourself. The first sentence is, "I'm a phenomenologist."
Yes.
And in my neighborhood, somebody would probably respond with, "Well, the vein in my right arm is usually better than my left arm." And I just thought, why don't you tell us what a phenomenologist is?
I would say very simply that what I mean by that is that I'm a philosopher who starts out from paying attention to the lived experience of people.
Very good. And you're an associate professor of worldview studies at ICS. You're also a leadership educator. You've been CEO at Center for Public Justice. Thank you. It's already been a long morning, and you've been at Fuller and their Leadership Institute. You've edited Comment Magazine for a decade. So you're, I think, something of an activist. Your website talks about being committed to, very prominently, the flourishing of Africa.
Yeah.
And you're kind of a nightingale going back and forth between the continents, right?
Yeah.
You want to tell us a little about your instinct for activism as an intellectual?
Sure. Yeah. So that leads directly into what I will want to be saying, because my interest and my concern for the connection between Neocalvinism and economics comes out of my own lived experience as a South African growing up in the last few years of the apartheid political order in South Africa, struggling as a young follower of Jesus to see how I might find a connection between following Jesus and responding to apartheid in that setting. And I grew up in an academic family. Both of my parents are academics, and so if you struggle with something, you look for books. And so I found in the late 1980s, after trying out other versions of Christian engagement with political life as an anti-apartheid activist in my teens and 20s, discovered the New Calvinist tradition and found in it some of the things that I was looking for in other places. So, my interest in New Calvinism and economics comes out of an activist background as someone who participated in the struggle against apartheid during the 1980s and then tried to figure out how to contribute to a post-apartheid South Africa in the early 1990s. One way in which I did that, again, as the child of academics, was to do my own graduate work on these questions. So I did my PhD work on the question of the role of the state in relation to the alleviation of poverty after the end of apartheid and before really the exploration of what a post-apartheid political economic order might look like. And in that process, had conversations in the early 1990s with New Calvinist scholars from around the world. So in 1992, we organized in South Africa a conference on Christianity and democracy in Africa. And we invited people from all over the continent to join us in a conversation as we try to understand what the contribution of Christians might be in forging a new democratic order in South Africa after the end of apartheid. And we invited people from around the world who could contribute to that conversation, both academics, people from think tanks, and people from established organized efforts to address these various issues in their own countries. So we invited Christian democratic politicians from Europe. We invited people from think tanks in the United States and Canada. We had some scholars from Korea. And so that was a context in which I had some of my first interpersonal interactions with people who came out of a New Calvinist tradition and tried to address the kind of concerns that we were trying to address. How do you shape a new political and economic order after you've been so profoundly warped as a society by a deep racism? In that setting, as I was doing early work on my PhD at the time, I met with someone called James Skillen. So James Skillen was the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Public Justice. We had this conversation, and James Skillen said, well, there's this guy, Abraham Kuyper, who thinks you should be reading on these questions. And so it's in that setting that I first encountered Kuyper, and particularly Kuyper's thought on economic life, and encountered it in a talk that Kuyper gave in 1891 in Amsterdam at the First Christian Social Congress, which has been published in a variety of formats, most recently in this Makers of Modern Christian Social Thought volume on Leo XIII and Abraham Kuyper on the social question that's been edited by the previously mentioned Jordan Baller. So thank you, Jordan. So in this talk, I encountered what I experienced as a profound challenge to my heart, to my deepest self, in relation to the challenge of contributing to a post-apartheid South Africa. Kuyper says early in this address to Christians trying to deal with the problem of poverty in the Netherlands in the late 19th century, raises this question: what should we as confessors of Christ do about the social needs of our time? He suggests then to that audience at that time, so this is in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, from Kuyper's perspective, in the aftermath of the French Revolution and its outflow in terms of the structuring of society in Europe, Kuyper suggests that serious doubt has arisen, and I quote him, about the soundness of the social structure in which we live. And he suggests that at that time, in that context, public opinion is at war over the foundation on which a more appropriate and therefore more livable social order might be built. This attracted me immediately because it addressed a situation to which I could relate, a situation in which Christians were faced with a social order that appeared to be profoundly broken and damaging and not genuinely livable for people in that particular social order. Perhaps the little segment of Kuyper's address in 1891 that struck me most, it struck me genuinely like a lightning bolt, it was like bam, was when he said this, in the English translation that I've used, which is not quite this one. This is what Kuyper says. Only one thing is necessary if the social question is to exist for you. You must realize the present state of affairs cannot hold, and you must account for this untenability not by incidental causes, but by a fault in the very foundation of our society's organization. If you do not acknowledge this and think that social evil can be exorcised through an increase in piety or through friendlier treatment or more generous charity, then you may believe that we face a religious question or possibly a philanthropic question, but you will not recognize the social question. Kuyper continues to say, this question does not exist for you until you exercise an architectonic critique of human society, which leads to a desire for a different arrangement of the social order. If you read the rest of what Kuyper has to write, his fundamental argument is that the economic order of the Netherlands in the late 19th century is built on the premises of human autonomy and the survival of the fittest. And his argument is that that economic order is evil. That's the language that he uses for that. So the extreme atomistic individualism of late 19th century Dutch economic life, in his perspective, would be not an unlivable house. It would be a house of evil. And so he invites Christians to recognize that evil and then to address it. So I'm a philosopher. I work at the Institute for Christian Studies. We're a house full of philosophers. We are all about doing scholarship and doing academic work. And so, yes, I am interested in what an architectonic critique of the social order might look like from a philosophical perspective. I think that question like that, which Kurt raises right at the beginning of, can there be a Christian economics, is a necessary question and a question that Christians engaged in both economic life and in economic scholarship should be asking themselves, or at a minimum should be asking themselves, how as Christians do we engage in the practice of economic scholarship? I think there's an array of possible answers to that. This is, however, not the question that most deeply strikes me when I think about the interaction between Neocalvinism and economic life. What is for me of far greater concern is the actual lived responses of Christians to the economic orders in which we find ourselves. How do we as Christians respond to the world as we find it? What contribution do we make through our activism, through our scholarship, through our citizenship when we have the rights of participating in a democratic order? And as I've struggled with this question over some decades now, I'm 51, and the question first became real for me in a lift way in my teens. One of the things that has really struck me as I look at Kuyper and what Kuyper did in his time, and then look at my own experience, is the thinness of what's available in the church context in which I find myself, in terms of a traction for this question in people's faith lives. I spend August to May of every year in Canada. My school is in Toronto, but I spend May to August of every year in Stellenbosch in South Africa. Stellenbosch is, in my personal opinion, the most beautiful town in the world. And I invite you to visit it so that you can disagree with me if you'd like to, but I'm persuaded that you'll come away convinced that it is indeed the most beautiful town in the world. It is also possibly the single most unequal place on the planet. Right now, whatever measure you use, and there are several different ways of measuring inequality, South Africa is the most unequal nation in the world. Again, using the same array of ways in which to measure inequality, of all the local government areas in South Africa, Stellenbosch is the most unequal of all local government areas in the country. So the most beautiful place that I know is also one of the places where you can find the most grindingly horrifying differences in the life possibilities of people immediately adjacent to one another. When I'm in Stellenbosch, I live in a wonderful neighborhood. I can walk out onto the street at 10:30 at night, and every 5 minutes would have a private security vehicle pass me. I am as safe as you can be anywhere on the planet as a human being, and I am in the context of an unimaginable degree of wealth. Stellenbosch has quite literally within this local government area more US dollar billionaires than I have fingers on one hand. And the wealth of the richest people in Stellenbosch is evident throughout the city and makes a wonderful contribution to many of the aspects of life in that city. Stellenbosch is a university town, and wonderful contributions to the life of that university is made possible by gifts from the wealthiest of people in Stellenbosch. If, however, I get in a car and I drive from where I live in Stellenbosch and I drive no further than 5 minutes, I find myself in the Kayamandi neighborhood where people live unimaginably horrifying lives. The church with which I work most frequently when I'm in Stellenbosch on educational projects has a community center in Kayamandi where they offer study facilities for high school students because there's no electricity in people's homes. So this is an area where a space where people have light and they can study, but the community center insists that students leave in groups when they leave the study center, and they insist that they leave no later than 8:30 because people die after 8:30 on the streets of Kayamandi. The level of poverty in that community is as horrifying as I've seen anywhere in my travels around the world. This is literally 5 minutes apart. And so I find myself in Stellenbosch experiencing a lived dissonance between the practiced and professed Christianity of my friends and hosts in that setting and the way in which that town functions and the way in which that society functions. This is 25 years, this is a quarter century after the end of apartheid in South Africa, and we still have a profoundly broken societal situation. So for me, the interaction between the kind of things that Kuyper says about economic life and my own lived experience of economic life in South Africa raises a number of questions. Perhaps for me the most profound question is, what should church be like in a town like Stellenbosch so that it generates the kind of human beings who have the capacity to discern the social question, so that these would be persons for whom the social question exists, to use Kuyper's phrase. Out of that, I wonder, what might a constructive vision for economic life look like once one has done an architectonic critique of post-apartheid South African society? What kind of vision is actually a viable vision? And I think that there's a tremendous debate, and I think that the debate for that is one to which Christians need to significantly contribute in the South African setting. And then finally, I wonder what practical collaborative actions South African Christians can take now in response to the social needs of our time in the South African setting. I had the privilege in the Canadian context of working for the Christian Labour Association of Canada for a decade, so for 10 years. This is an organization of, by now, very nearly or more than 60,000 working people working in construction and healthcare and a variety of other sectors of society and of economic life. It's a labor union. It's organized on Kuyperian principles. It's informed by the Catholic social tradition. And it makes the argument that Christian working people should organize themselves to participate in negotiating for and struggling for more just workplaces. That kind of collaborative action is the kind of thing that I could imagine making a difference in the South African setting. I don't think that the Christian church in South Africa offers the kind of catechetical experience, homiletical experience, or liturgical experiences that shape people who are able to do that kind of collaborative work at this time. And thus my question goes back to what church should look like in South Africa to enable that. Thank you.
We have 35 minutes left. Let's say we'll try to talk among the panelists for about 15 minutes. We'll just see how it goes, and then we'll all talk for about 20 minutes. And let me try to bring some spontaneous order to this conversation of ours by suggesting this. How about if we organize our discussion along another continuum in Kuyper's thought, Neo-Calvinist thought, that I don't think I've heard come up, and that is this tension continuum between antithesis and common grace. Because I think I was hearing, the same question coming up, but it being phrased and perhaps an answer suggested that would place us at different points along that continuum between emphasizing antithesis and common grace. Let me start at what feels to me like the positive end of the continuum, that Neo-Calvinism has something special to offer, which is kind of a positive way of talking about antithesis. There's really something special here, something unique, maybe. And at least the family of Neo-Calvinist and modern Roman Catholic social thought together in conversation expresses something that's life-giving and that isn't heard very often, that's visionary, that can frame up it's a fog cutter that gets you through the really maladaption of the modern world. So there's like one end of the continuum. Maybe sphere sovereignty has something special to tell us about public policy or about wealth. Maybe it's a good source for activism, because I heard of several people this conference saying that it was kind of that was their moment. Encountering Neo-Calvinism was a visionary moment that set them on a path. Maybe it's a vision for recovering something from a warped world, which in Kuyper's phrasing often came out the revolutionary world, the French revolution of autonomy and human reason and natural selection. Maybe this is an alternative vision that's compelling, that's life-giving, directive. That would be, said in a positive way, the maximally antithetical position, I think, right? Let me just move one step down the continuum. Oh yeah? Did Neo-Calvinism really successfully navigate historicism? Did it even ever get in conversation with the marginalist revolution in economics that's 150 years old by now? Isn't it only grasping for its own receding cultural power, and it finds the recession going a little faster than its arm can reach? So maybe there's still some healthy antithesis, but it's either underdeveloped or something's been in its way that's impeded its success, or it hasn't listened very well. That seemed to me like the middle point of the antithesis to, if you wanted to be maximally common grace, which I hear that word generally being said as a positive, isn't it great we all get along and we have a common vision, but you could also phrase it as kind of a negative comment about Neo-Calvinism. I think what if you say, no, Neo-Calvinism is just got nothing special to offer. Take a guy like Hayek, who seems to be very committed to the autonomy project of the modern world. Look at the implications of his thinking, hold it next to Kuyper's, and you might say, oh, there's so much overlap there. Really? Can you talk there seriously about antithesis anymore when people with such divergent points of view seem to end up with a very common understanding, one might say, about what vision for the world, practical policy in the world. So there you go. Is Neo-Calvinism something special, but something kind of underdeveloped and unexplored? Or to put it harshly, nothing special. It's just a different community with a different vocabulary that's saying things we could get to from a different perspective. There you go.
Well, if I could insert one thing, I should have expected, since this is the Acton Institute, that I was expecting there would be some
How about if Sarah and I will share one mic,
Sure.
and you and Gideon share the other,
All right.
and then when we get to the conversation, we'll work it out. Okay?
Is that on? There we go. I was expecting that there would maybe be some anti-capitalist voice somewhere. We haven't heard it yet, so I'm going to take. I'm going to take. Okay. Well, maybe he could insert that, but I'll take up the rare position for myself of criticizing the market and something that's going on, of course, which is the destruction of small communities and the production of these differences between places. And I live in West Virginia and drive into DC, and I see, so I live in this blue-red world. On both sides, very extreme differences. And one thing I notice on the drive is that the people change. In DC, they're tall, they're thin, they're healthy. In West Virginia, they're short, they're fat, they limp, they have canes. And it's not just that the environment is better in DC than it is in West Virginia. West Virginia it repulses people, it pushes people out. DC is an attractor. And we get this in market societies, is that people get pulled out of their communities. And something that I'm very worried about, and this comes from my study of folklore and traditional communities, cultural anthropology, is the loss of community at the local level. And perhaps this is something where Kuyper can come in and say some criticism of the market, is that I think there was a time when we had small communities where people knew each other, where neighbors knew each other, and we can talk about, there's all sorts of reasons why this is broken down, some to do with the market, perhaps some to do with welfare, Social Security, all kinds of things. But it used to be the case that local communities had a mixture of talent. This morning at the coffee shop in Grand Rapids, I met, not to be crass, the village idiot. I met a person in the coffee shop who was clearly homeless, not really causing trouble, but very, out of place, making people uncomfortable. We forget about these differences because we've pushed the worst of society into homes, and the best of society in local villages, we've pushed them to cities, right? So if you go to New York City, if you go to Brooklyn, all of the best young people in the United States live in Brooklyn and San Francisco, right? All the most ambitious. And so we've taken out of the villages this young dynamic force, the community, the things that keep people together. And this is something that I worry about a lot in the division of labor, what it does to local communities. It leaves the old and the lonely in one place and puts all the strong in another. And one of the advantages, of course, is the immense wealth that we have because of this. But one of the losses that we have is the personal connections. And so perhaps Kuyper and sphere sovereignty has something to say about this, about preserving local communities, of maybe our responsibilities to move into these communities, to not try to ghettoize ourselves, where you see these neighborhoods, and even in Grand Rapids today, driving through East Grand Rapids, you have neighborhoods where all these houses are 100,000, all these are 200,000, all these are 3, et cetera, et cetera. We live completely isolated from other socioeconomic groups. I mean, it's absolutely terrible. You don't have a neighbor to mow your lawn because your neighbor also makes $100,000 a year. It's crazy what we've done with how we've segregated ourselves by economic class.
I think capitalism needs to be defended.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if I was criticizing it directly, but social effects of the marketplace.
Yeah. So I'm searching for an explanation for why we would necessarily think that there's something superior to cities than local communities, or that we would live that out in educated youth moving into cities if there weren't some. I wonder how much there's a market, right? I mean, oftentimes when people say, look, there's a market failure, I look to see where is the market, right? Where is there not actually a market? And I wonder what policy context has made it look like there aren't people who just simply prefer to live in small communities. There must be, right? I think there's diversity of tastes and preferences in that regard. And so I'm trying to quickly reference hillbilly elegy in my mind and kind of come up with a theory on the spot. But it seems to me that for those who've read hillbilly elegy, that's a great story of someone who is committed to their roots, values their roots, even for the negative aspects of his culture, but then still to do what he needs to do has to go somewhere else. I don't know that that's the market making that happen. What is it? I'm not an urban economist. I wish I was, because I could probably come up with some explanations. But I guess I'd have to question whether that's the result of market economies, or whether market economies would actually lead to more diverse choices, with some people explicitly choosing smaller communities with more connections with their neighbors, and others enjoying the city life.
Michael, I'll just suggest the next paper for you to write, and because I'd like to read a paper like this, and I haven't seen it. So this so-called Tebow hypothesis in the 50s and 60s, I think the default wouldn't it be great if we could just zone neighborhoods to be quite distinct so that people could self-select? Because that's what markets do. You can buy the 10-ounce pork rinds, you can get the 12-ounce hot and spicy pork rinds. Why don't we just set up urban areas like that? You want the neighborhood without gutters, with so-so schools, fine, you can live there. You can live in my neighborhood, you know? You want the East Grand Rapids, they'll come to your door and pick up your garbage can for you and take it down to the machine and take it back to your, you can do that. Just pay a little higher taxes. We'll just make it a market for the services people wish, and markets are efficient. Won't that be great? And the ways in which that's become dysfunctional, I think, would be a really nice paper. Certainly part of the story, I would think, is the way that we rig those markets by redlining, by federal policy in our own little quiet apartheid system. But I bet you could talk through other things about concentrations of wealth and how they inhibit mobility, and so that project just kind of has fallen apart in my view.
I think the thing about that is it's great for people that have choice, right? My parents loved living in those kind of neighborhoods. I hated it. And there's a lot of people that live in cul-de-sacs. Like the suicide rate of kids living in cul-de-sacs is a lot higher than it is on kids that live in neighborhoods that are interconnected with multiple roads where they can go places. So there's a lot of us that don't make those choices about where we end up in that marketplace.
To maybe get back to your question of antithesis and common grace in relation to these conversations, I think Kuyper deployed an antithetical approach and a common grace approach rhetorically, depending on what he needed to get done in particular situations. So when he needed to rally rural, conservative, reformed, working class and small farm class folk, he was at his most antithetical, made claims explicitly grounded in the Word of God, and addressed something that I think you raised, that sense of receding cultural power, which Reformed folk in the Netherlands experienced at least from 1848, when the Netherlands enacted a liberal constitution in the classical sense. And so while I would agree with the antithetical position that Kuyper presents, I think it's important to recognize that he deploys that position rhetorically, depending on circumstance. And then when he needed to collaborate, say with Schaapman and the Catholic political party, or with others across the board across the range of political opinion and philosophical differences, he deployed a common grace rhetoric and emphasized those human commonalities which we have because we live in a shared world, right? And I think to some extent, and I don't mean that as a criticism, that's exactly how I go about things. I deploy common grace rhetoric when I need to be able to collaborate with people who profoundly disagree with me, so as to be able to discover those things that we share as humans, that we share because we live in a shared reality and a shared world, which is discernible for any human person, whether that's in my scholarship or in my activism. And I deploy an antithetical rhetoric when I need to ground myself in the deepest commitments which I hold, which differ from those people with whom I'm trying to either disagree or with whom I'm trying to collaborate. So I don't think that these are choices that one has to make. I don't think these are choices that Kuyper made.
So, okay, that's the use of the words rhetorically, strategically, for rhetoric, political purposes, you might say. I think I'm asking just ontologically, is there any there, right? If there's no there, if you can get to the same conclusions from kind of many bases, that might explain the thinness of resources in churches, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not taking a position on that. It seems to me that's what we're talking about this morning. Where do we land on that continuum from there's a there in Neocalvinism, there's something special, or it's just rhetorical?
So to directly respond to that,
Yeah.
and I apologize if I'm diving in beforehand, I would argue that there is a there. I would argue that the there that is there is perhaps most discernible in the practice of philosophy, in the range of available disciplines. So, for example, epistemologically, when you build the philosophical infrastructure for the practice of any discipline, you're going to start somewhere. You're going to start from some place. That is how scholarship happens. I know that there are contemporary and recent philosophers who would disagree that one has to start somewhere, and so you could sort of do rhizomic scholarship and just touch base in the in the localities in which you find yourself, either in disciplinary practice or in lived experience. But I would argue that no, we do in fact start our scholarship from somewhere. And where we start our scholarship has profound and discernible consequences for the scholarship that we do. So the economic discipline, for example, is not homogeneous. There are diverse economics approaches, and how one takes those different approaches has discernible differences in what you see, in how you see what you see, in what you make of what you see. There are contrary theories for a wide variety of economic phenomena that continue to be at very least contestable, and they are to some extent the result of where you start from. Kuyper and the Kuyperian philosopher that informs the book that I do, Herman Dooyeweerd, would argue that the very first place that you start when you do scholarship has to do with whether or not you start with the notion of autonomous human reason or not. And I think it's possible to show in the practice of philosophy that starting with autonomous human reason or not starting with autonomous human reason makes a genuine difference in what your philosophical system then looks like, while being in enthusiastic dialogue with other philosophical systems and being affected by those. I cannot do philosophy today without attending to other people who are doing philosophy today. That affects, among other things, my vocabulary. I have to use words with which to talk to other philosophers in this time. Those words already hold meaning, which already affects what I'm able to say. But so I would say that at the very, very minimum, there's a there in saying that we have to start from somewhere, and that somewhere in the context of Western philosophical work has to be autonomous reason or some source of revelation.
It's suddenly a little bit past time for us all to be talking together. So,
Sorry,
please.
that was long.
No, that
No,
was
it's
great.
terrific. Thank you. But time keeps marching on, doesn't it? So I'll repeat what's said from the floor to be sure that the tape gets it. Who would like to go first? Please, in the second row of humans here.
Quick question on the economic capitalist question. In the last 200 years, give or take, it's demonstrable that the market economy, we can parse what capitalism means, but the market economy has shown exponential, fact-based growth in the ability of globalization, jobs, and trade to drag hundreds of millions, if not billions of people out of poverty. So we have the, in aggregate, good of market economies, growth, globalization, while in opposed to certain pockets, like your story in Stellenbosch and West Virginia, etc., that there are fact-dependent issues, right, that we're not arguing with. There is still evil structural issues in the world, but largely the free market system has been hugely, and I mean, the preponderance of the evidence is in the positive for the good of billions of people. So I'm wondering if we can, using your rhetorical word, that rhetorical, using small snippets of true historical issues that are negative, belies the fact that in aggregate, capitalism or free market systems have actually had a positive good.
Gideon, maybe you take a stab at restating that for the tape. And then Michael can answer it.
So the argument is that, for example, my position against capitalism would be proven to be mistaken by the literally billions of people who've been lifted out of poverty, say, since 1988, at least 1 billion people since 1988 globally, by the operations of a free market system.
Okay. Well, I mean, you're preaching to the choir with me. I mean, I'm about as pro-capitalist as you can be, even despite my earlier statements. And yet, at the same time, I would push back and say, you say it's a demonstrably good. Well, your good is subjective again, in that it's a good based on economic wealth. I mean, there's other sources of good. There's social interaction. There's I mean, what does the market have to say about Christianity and the spread of religion? I mean, has it helped or hurt traditional religion? I don't know. I think it works a little bit both ways. And so I think you're absolutely right. Historically, it's created mass wealth. And I think the freer our system is, the more wealth there's going to be. And a lot of our problems that we have are going to be solved. But there's still going to be other problems caused in the system. Inequality is going to be a problem, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't disagree with you there. But there's room for criticisms of the market and the resulting effects of it, even if you agree from consequentialists or whatever deontological position that this is what we ought to have.
Gideon, Sarah, anything to chip in?
I guess I just wanted to go back to Gideon's question that he posed as perhaps an appropriate response here, which is to say, so what should church life be like? So markets have done an amazing thing, division of labor, trade, that I think happened in response to really a Christian vision of the human person being made in the image of a creative God and really living into that has done amazing things. So now that we live in this immense wealth, what next? I think is a great question. We don't want to undo the gains in wealth, but we have different challenges in front of us. We have different temptations as individuals. We have different opportunities for what we can accomplish in light of the great wealth. So I think markets can help with many of those questions, but I think that the church can help in a lot of different ways, and frankly, a free marketplace of ideas is really key as well to taking the opportunities that wealth has given us and working towards these greater goods, which are subjective, but I think Christians have a lot to contribute to defining those things as well.
So I would argue that capitalism has not in fact generated mass wealth. It has generated intensely concentrated wealth. I would agree that since I think roughly 1988, at least 1 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty globally. None of those people were lifted out, as best as I can tell, in simple, open, libertarian, free market settings. The lifting out of poverty that occurred since 1988 occurred in China, it occurred in South Korea, it occurred in Taiwan, it's occurring right now in Vietnam, it's occurring to some extent right now in Ethiopia, and each of those were political economies that were premised on something entirely different from free market capitalism. they were informed quite explicitly by an historicist understanding of economic orders. There's a magnificent historical study of this in a book called How Asia Works. And so I think one has to be honest in saying that the operation of markets are a tremendous good. The existence and the introduction of markets into the Chinese, South Korean, Vietnamese, and other settings made a profound difference in what was possible for people in terms of being lifted out of poverty. Yes, markets are the preferable way for economic systems to work, but free markets, in the sense of unfettered by state intervention, never function well in terms of lifting people out of poverty. It is when you have normatively guided, highly state activist market economies that you find that happening, historically speaking.
So what I'm hearing is there's no longer a discussion about whether market economies are good. It's a question about what kind of market economy we're going to form.
Yeah, I've learned something recently, and maybe some of you know this literature better than I do, but I was in Guatemala and Mexico City a couple months ago, same trip, went to the two places, and I have a friend who teaches political science there in Mexico City, and one of the things he studies is state capacity, which is a really interesting concept. It's the idea that you can't just declare a free market zone and have people go at trading, because somebody's going to take over, there's going to be bandits, it's going to be all sorts of problems. And I don't know where I stand on this historically, I haven't done the research, but that first you need to establish control over a territory, the Weberian sense of what a government is, and then you can initiate some sort of market transactions, and over time, as these traditions and cultures build, people become more used to trading, and it can become more and more of a free market. The problem in a place like Mexico is that Mexico doesn't have sufficient state capacity. Half of Mexico they can't get any tax revenue from because it's run by gangs, right? And this creates a real problem in a lot of places in Central America where the state doesn't have control over the markets. And so there is no such thing as a free market in that situation, because what arises in that situation is cartels and power by force, and people aren't trading freely because there's no security of law, et cetera, et cetera. And this is why I'm ultimately some form of minarchist or something, because I don't think in the absence of a state that these markets could function safely for very long without some power coming in just crushing it.
I'm sure I saw another hand a minute ago. Please.
I was wondering, I love the portions on the social question that you read. And one of the things that strikes me, I'm always uneasy with Kuyper's anti-modernism. And one of the reasons is I think the very visibility of the poor is something that arises out of modernism. And maybe Sarah knows the volume. There was a volume edited by Hayek. It wasn't all his contribution, but sort of going back and looking at living standards in the 19th century. And basically going back and looking at what people like Kuyper were seeing in the present day. And saying that, what is seen now is that the poverty is now visible. And the poverty is visible because urbanization, because they're actually living, because the rich are now actually living next to the poor in a way that they weren't. And you have increased literacy, and the poor are increasingly able to make themselves visible to the rich. Is Kuyper's anti-modernism appropriately grounded when we know that in the 19th century, living standards were being raised? It's understandable that poverty is now visible in a new way because the poor are becoming politically enfranchised, labor organizations going on, the poor are beginning to read, write, advocate for themselves. Is what Kuyper's seeing actually a positive outcome of modernity?
Sarah, would you take a stab at restating that for the tape? And then I think the question was looking mostly at Gideon, so maybe we can give Gideon first shot at commenting.
All right, well, y'all jump in if I miss any big pieces here, but I think the question really focuses on whether poverty has just become more visible for the fact that the poor are now living in closer proximity to the non-poor, becoming literate to a greater extent, more enfranchisement and just more engagement between social classes. So that's where I lose it in terms of the root of the question. And so maybe the question is, do we agree that that's really what maybe looks like concentration of wealth to the extent where we're not lifting the poor out of poverty, but actually we could be raising all ships at the same time. It's just still a visible or more visible difference.
Maybe with that, Kuyper is being too
Yes.
hostile toward modernism
Yes.
because modernism made this possible.
Right, thank you for, that was the choice.
So I think Kuyper can certainly be accused of being romantic at time in the sense of romanticism in the late 19th century, and certainly the sort of organicist metaphors that he uses for society is problematic, and it's also of his time. I don't think it's entirely fair to call Kuyper an anti-modernist, because I think the anti-revolutionary party, for example, was quite explicitly not counter-revolutionary but anti-revolutionary. It was not a reactionary movement. It didn't want to go back to before. It wanted a different deployment of the possibilities of the now and into the future. I think it's entirely so that the poor became more visible in the late 19th century. I mean, I like, yay for that beautiful curve, from the Industrial Revolution onwards of people just being lifted out of poverty globally, starting in Europe and expanding. And I think that, yes, that's premised on, it's premised on science, it's premised on technology, it's premised on industrialization, it's premised on urbanization. There's a whole bunch of factors that enabled that. And this is one reason why I would say, I'm not against market economies. I am profoundly against market societies. I'm profoundly against societies in which the mechanisms of the market are absolutized to every sphere of life. And I think that's the argument that Kuyper would want to make, that, yeah, markets work for what they do, but they don't explain everything, and they should not be allowed to make everything happen.
Sure.
One of my observations, I share your observation on Kuyper and his appreciation of markets, but he doesn't, in his speech at the Social Congress, I think what he's doing when you read it is he's asking questions about socialism as an economic system and capitalism as an economic system for that very reason, because he doesn't want to vest everything and baptize any economic system as the answer. So, but in this whole context, what I'm also thinking about is you're talking about West Virginia and all these other challenges and Stellenbosch, is that perhaps, and I was in another section where Kuyper talks about the pace of change, the pace of social change. And Kuyper was making observations about the pace of social change related to the telegraph and how it's sped up communications and how we get, and mail, and how you get too much mail every day. And so I wonder if some of the challenge isn't an economic market system as much as it is the pace of change, so that over the course of one person's lifetime in West Virginia, you can go from being a coal miner with a decent income and be able to support a family, and then our pace of change in globalization and the pace at which we live, in part because of technology, is gone. And I don't know, so what would Kuyper say about the pace of social change, and where do we root that in his thinking?
Michael, would you take a stab at restating
Yeah.
that for us?
Well, there's a number of things going on in this question. I don't know if I can restate it so much as give some answers to it, because otherwise I'll forget my answers if I try to restate it. First thing is, I think this is also the period when the Pope is giving his encyclical, and they're responding to the Depression in the United States in 1892, 1893, and one thing about this period we have to remember is that it's not decided yet whether capitalism or socialism is going to be the economically more efficient system. And there's a lot of arguments that central planning and design is the way forward, and this is what progressives attach themselves to. And so I think he doesn't have the evidence yet, and there's a reason for him to hesitate. Because I think even I would be sympathetic in 1890 to say, well, maybe we got to try this scientific, organized system of experts running things, and maybe we'll know. The other thing is I do think a lot about the pace of change, as you mentioned, and we've, like, in the last 20 years, sometimes we forget this. We're almost living in this, like, to use metaphors, we're living in this, like, vortex. Like, in the past 20 years, like 1,000 years of change has happened. Like, we forget how much has actually developed. In that, somebody like Kuyper would hardly recognize society today, be overwhelmed by all kinds of things in our system in society. But as far as, I mean, I don't know Kuyper well enough. Maybe Gideon can answer the question of how would he respond to the pace of change as a threat to traditional life and to Christianity and stuff. I mean, I'm thinking back to, like, Isaac de Costa and these guys in the Netherlands who are writing against tegen de geest der eeuw, against the spirit of the age. The massive change that they saw as a threat to traditional life, the Enlightenment values, is minuscule compared to what we've seen in the 20th century. And so, are they conservative in the sense that they're real, afraid of those little kind of changes relative to what we've seen? I mean, if these 19th century people would have lived through the 20th century, or could be alive today and be like, holy cow, what has happened? I mean, I'm a romantic. I live in the 19th century, and and sometimes I say to people, I try to surprise them, and I say, look, civilization peaked in 1914, you guys. It's all downhill. We're living in a dystopian future, and we've got a lot of problems that have arisen in the 20th century that we have to deal with.
Speaking of the rapid pace of change, suddenly, yes, we're done, and we need to go out to the coffee bar before everybody else takes our coffee. So let's thank our panelists, and thank you for being here.